Russell Worth Parker is a retired U.S. Marine raider turned writer and best-selling ghostwriter. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Garden and Gun, and Backcountry Journal, among others. He works closely with a number of veteran publications and writing workshops, including PB Abate and Lethal Minds Journal. When he's not writing, you'll find him walking the woods of North Carolina and talking books with his fellow Marine and previous guest on this podcast, John Dailey. Michael Mick Patrick Mullroy is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. He is a retired CIA paramilitary operations officer in the Special Activities Center and a retired U.S. Marine. He is currently the president of Fogbow, a company that enables international humanitarian efforts, a senior fellow for the Middle East Institute, and an ABC News national security analyst, and co-founder of the Lobo Institute, the co-president of End Child Soldiering, and on the board of advisors for Plato's Academy Center and the Aurelius Foundation. Mick and Worth have teamed up on a variety of humanitarian missions, including working to end child soldiering and delivering food and aid to Gaza. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Gentlemen, thanks for being here. I know that we've had world affairs get in the way a couple of times trying to make this episode happen, but it's great to finally sit down with you.
Great to be here, Charlie.
Great to be here.
A good story as well. I think it's genetic.
Genetic.
Yeah. We were talking just before the show about Irish stubbornness, which I think we could probably do a whole episode on.
Series. You could do a series.
Do you think that, I know like in Stoicism, you talk about virtues a lot. It seems to me that stubbornness, I'm trying to think of another quality that has as much of a balance of kind of good and bad in the way it might impact your life. Like there's good ways to be stubborn and some very difficult ways too.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I'm happy to, don't want to overwhelm it with stoicism, which sometimes I've been on podcasts, I'm like, oh my God, he's still talking about stoicism. But I think in some sense, courage is the virtue that best denotes stubbornness, in the sense that it all depends, to the point of your question, Charlie, is whether you're stubborn for a good reason. If you are wrong and stubborn, that is not a virtue. If you are, up to no good, that is not a virtue. But if you are champion for justice, another virtue in stoicism, and you won't take no for an answer, then the stubbornness, I think, is something to be lauded, right? But in and of itself, and yes, I mean, I don't want to go too on the Irish. The Irish can be a champion of good and a champion of not so good, right? We're across the spectrum, which is why I think we make such good stories, right? You got to have both to make a good story. But I do think, ultimately, if your persistence is for a good cause, then it is not only a good attribute, but sometimes it's a necessity to get it done, right? It's easy to say, hey, I want to do good stuff in the world. Hey, you're not going to be able to do it. Okay, I quit, right? So that's just, not ever going to get anything done, especially some of the challenges that are around the world.
Yeah, and we're about to get into those, but there's one thing I wanted to start with and kind of face head on, because I know there's kind of a range of listeners, and some folks on my side of the Atlantic in Europe are listening to this who might not think that like doing the right thing and U.S. foreign policy or U.S. military could go hand in hand. And Worth, there was something I heard you talk about, a barracks dichotomy, and on this other podcast, and I loved how you described the complexity there, I guess I want to kind of start with the listener who might have a really fixed idea of, well, I must know this person's politics because they were in the U.S. military or something like that, where there's a lot of nuance that probably gets missed in that characterization.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question of that. I mean, I've certainly had people ascribe political views to me that are more or less anathema to me, or at least not remotely within the Venn diagram of my belief system, which is, wholly scattershot and schizophrenic. But it is still mine. So that barracks dichotomy, I mean, what I'm talking about is really the ability to disagree vociferously and still come together for a very important common cause, be that group survival, individual survival, and the accomplishment of an objective, or if it's just the ability to go, as I often do with people in my own life who I love very much, some of the people I'm closest to in the world, and I don't necessarily agree on politics. And, it's no secret that politics are perhaps particularly fractious in the States right now. And we're a nation born of fractiousness and frankly founded upon fractiousness as an ideal to a certain extent. Can't really talk about federalism without talking about it. But that being said, it's the old, I can hate what you say and not hate you. Some of that, I think, is getting lost to our own detriment in modern American culture right now. And I do think that's a problem we need to collectively overcome. And to me, it's an incredibly complex problem, an incredibly simple solution, which is to just decide not to participate in that.
And it seems like the easy way out for a lot of people is to just like sort of become apolitical or disengaged, and which isn't really the same thing and doesn't solve the problem you're describing, if I understand you.
Yeah, no, it is an individual decision. It probably ties in some to Stoicism, which of course Mick is vastly more qualified than I to address. But it's the idea that I can have a different belief system than you and still choose to see your essential goodness. Essential goodness is something that's each of ours to lose, and that's done through choice and through action. But I say all the time, my best friend and I mean, my very best friend in the world, the guy who's the godfather to my daughter, my best man at my wedding, college roommate, Marine buddy, we've been together through all the trials and tribulations that life brings all of us since we were 17 years old. We probably won't vote the same way. That's okay. I'm not going to forego or lose or sacrifice all the beauty that comes out of having a critical friendship with that human being over what I respect as, ideals and decisions born of his very credible intellect.
Well said.
Thank you.
I think that's a lot of,
If I could,
yeah, please.
Charlie, if I could hit one of the points you made about the military and U.S. foreign policy, not to be too, waving the flag too much, but one thing that's often overlooked, and I think Morris can back me up on this, is just how much of the humanitarian effort around the world is done by the U.S. military. And it only could be done by the U.S. military because they have the capacity to project, in that case, their force for good, that no other military. I mean, even our adversaries, the highest adversaries, Russia, for example, could barely feed their troops, for example, in a country next door. But the U.S. military is very actively involved in humanitarian operations around the world. I do think, I tend to stay out publicly of politics. I don't belong to a party. But I would say that, the ideal for me is like a combination of, one quote from Kennedy, ask not. I'm sure I don't need to repeat it. Everybody knows what it is. And then the concept of Reagan, which was, the shining city on a hill and being the leader, the robust leader of the free world. Like, I do think that is the United States of America's destiny and the best of the United States. So I certainly hope in any inclination to go away from that is not successful, right? Other than that, I mean, most of politics now seems to be more about, what team you're on and not really about the policies you're discussing. And that I think maybe it's always been like that, but I do think it's super unhelpful. But if the U.S. can still focus on our unique place, our indispensable country, right, in the world, then I think we would all be better off. That doesn't mean we know everything and everything, and the arrogant American, I don't think we should ever be. But the idea that the rest of the world looks for us for that leadership in a time where there's a surge toward autocracy, it's never been more important. And this idea of isolationism, which has always existed in the United States, I think is just the wrong.
And I mean, we already have some really clear examples from history of where that leads. So you mentioned a humanitarian mission. I want to back up eventually and look at kind of the big picture of how and why you guys have approached these projects. But one that I feel like really didn't get that much attention, given how kind of important it was and central to such a hot issue, is in Gaza. And that was that was not just U.S. military involvement, but you guys personally were involved in that. Can you tell me a little bit about kind of what you did there, what's going on now, and the role of the U.S. in helping, basically feed people, is my understanding.
Sure, honest, I could start if you want. Worth would be good explaining how we've, obviously Worth and I have known each other for a long time, but one of the things we really started working on together after service was the Afghan withdrawal. So we really, that's when you saw so many vets step up to a humanitarian cause, if you will, during that. But from that, I'm in a group called, and so is Worth, Lobo Institute, which is essentially an association of people, military, mostly soft folks, but also humanitarians, Peace Corps, UN, NGOs, that comes together to try to take our skills that we've gotten in our past lives to basically help facilitate humanitarian efforts around the world, right? So we've worked for the UN in Yemen, we've worked for the State Department in Afghanistan, we have an NGO that deals with ending the use of children as soldiers. And then myself and Sam Mundy, General Mundy, were asked to look at putting together a team that could focus on this. Basically, the concept of Lobo with some funding behind it. And we started down that path. Obviously, a lot to go with putting together this humanitarian assistance disaster relief force with the capabilities of operational planning and execution that it would come from, like we're serving in MARSOC, or our chief operations officer being a SEAL and JSOC as a commander, and putting it to good use, when it comes to humanitarian efforts. And then Gaza kicked off. And so we were asked to immediately look at what we could do there to assist. And we came up with, it already existed, but our concept of the Maritime Corps, which was termed the Blue Beach. And that was essentially to take aid from Cyprus, in this case, because that's where the Al Mafia plan under the EU is already in existence, and bring it directly onto the beach in Gaza. You could do it at scale, so a considerable amount at once, and bring it directly to the places that were very difficult to access if you came in through the ground. Our plan did not call for any U.S. military involvement. It was much simpler. It didn't call for the military period. It had some resistance because there's a lot of political issues with the UN wanting to essentially force Israel to open up the ground corridors entirely. We stayed out of that, of course, entirely, and I still will. Our policy was always, ground, air, maritime, whatever we need to do to facilitate aid getting to people who are in desperate need of it. And it still is. But we briefed everybody, including the White House, a couple times. And then that led to the contribution of the Joint Logistics Over the Shore military group, right? And then we did everything we could once that was coming. And I do, I get the criticism, it wasn't really the right tool for the job because of the sea states. But, I'd also say that there's a lot of countries and individuals that sit around admiring a problem that essentially didn't do a damn thing. But then here comes the United States, pushing a pier from Virginia to Gaza, spending $230 million, and all they get is criticism, right? So, it's like a lot of talk, no action from the guys, on the sidelines, and it's really not the critic that counts, it's the man in the arena. And so I would, hats off to CENTCOM, particularly the Army component that dealt with all the conditions that made it challenging. And it did bring in a lot, and I think worth to get into stats if you want, of food into people who desperately needed it. We helped as much as we could, which includes like physically pushing the pier back and forth to make sure that it didn't get destroyed in the sea state back to Ashdod, which is another port. And also putting about 13% of the food across the pier came from us. So we're proud of it. It wasn't a perfect operation, but you're not going to get perfect in Gaza. But I'll stop there because I think Worth can certainly add to that. Worth is our future operations chief in Fogbo, and it's not just something we did. We're still directly involved in what's going on.
Yeah, I mean we're constantly looking to refine, improve, develop, what have you, these plants. And as Mick said, we had originally had a concept, and I'll own some of the perceptions, maybe the external perceptions of Americans, which was, and it goes back to the conversation about stubbornness, which also can be persistence and endurance. In January, we sat down and said, this is what we're going to do. And in my mind, I really believed we would be feeding, hungry people within about 60 days. And that only because we were limited by the realities of time, space, and distance. So our will to win and our will to serve, I was very confident was going to carry the day. I've had a good education over the last 9 months. That there are many, many, many vagaries when it comes to trying to feed starving people, which, again, to me, I had a Marine mentor who used to say all the time, and it's not original to him, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And to me, the main thing is to feed starving people. Regardless of what you think about politics, as we were talking about earlier, a 3-year-old kid is a 3-year-old kid. A 2-year-old who's in critical wasting, and I would be lying if I said to you I truly understood at a visceral level what critical wasting means, because though I've been hungry at times in my military career, I've never been anywhere remotely close to starvation. So it just seemed to me like if we showed up with piles of aid, everyone would go, cool, you're in on the team. Here's how we integrate you in. Here's how we're going to execute operations. That is not the case. The fact of the matter is politics does play heavily into things. But with that said, despite that, utilizing stubbornness, whether it be Irish or Scots or, descendants in the case of the faces on this screen, or any of the other multiplicities of people we have, we got 1,100 metric tons of flour into Gaza, which feeds literally millions of people. And there are 2 million people inside Gaza, and especially in July, as Mick said, we got 13% of the aid that went across the J-Lots Pier came from Fogbo. And that is not an inconsequential number, especially when you look at July as a food spike relative to the months prior and the months since. So again, I don't think it's unreasonable for people to criticize, the failures of that operation. But as Mick noted, there's a whole lot of sideline quarterbacks, and they're right over there on the sidelines, and not a one of them has taken a hit, and not a one of them has even, dressed up to play the game, if we're using good old American sports analogies. So I'm not tremendously interested in the criticism of people who don't enter the arena. I'm very interested in the criticism of people who are involved.
Sure. And to me, I mean, as someone who, my free time I spend on the ocean, and I volunteer in my local maritime search and rescue, and the idea of those skills being in demand is really fascinating to me, especially when you have folks like yourself where you would have trained for all sorts of amphibious things. But yeah, I mean, it's been a while since the U.S. has operated amphibiously, right?
Well, as the Army likes to point out, Normandy. Um, and I, as the Marine, like to point out, yeah, and then there's the 4 continuous years in the Pacific. So let's none of us get too big for britches. But yeah, I mean, Mick has an amphibious background, both, in the Marine Corps and within his paramilitary career. And I have, I was a Marine Force Recon and Marine Raider, so amphibious in its nature. I will always cop to the fact that I could have used water wings through pretty much every amphibious phase of training I ever went through, but I'm here. I made it. So for us, it really is about planning. And those are the persistent and enduring skills that we can take away from our service and apply to the good of our fellow human beings, regardless of where they are and regardless of their politics, because we know how to lend order to chaos. We know how to look at a situation and say, all right, starting at 0 and needing to get to 100, here's a well thought out plan that we can also change en route. It's flexible. These are all the skills that we learn. Our operations officer, who Mick alluded to earlier, is a SEAL. I'm a Marine. There are some natural tensions in philosophy between those two communities, and it works to our benefit. Because I did do 3 years at the Joint Special Operations Command, so I'm familiar with the mentality there. But I'm also very familiar with the Marine Corps mentality of deliberate planning. And we like to really try and nail down every detail and hammer down every nail in the process. And then sometimes somebody has to go, okay, we've planned for as long as we can plan. It's time to take action. And that's a really good aspect of the more rapid approach to planning that the JSOC history brings.
And something you said, and it's interesting too, we were talking about like Irish heritage, and when you look, I mean, obviously Ireland has an acutely sensitive relationship with starvation and famine I mean, if you're Irish and you're living anywhere other than Ireland, there's a good chance that your family left because they were starving. And one thing that's pointed out over here in the way that history is taught is that famine is a failure of all the things you're talking about, of logistics, of representative government. It's never a lack of food problem. When functioning societies run out of food, they find a way to whether it's trade or whatever. But like in Ireland's case, it was a colony being fleeced, and they were exporting grain while, like, during the potato famine. So in that sense, I mean, the thorniness of this problem and the idea that, because you described 60 days, I mean, even that's a long time, because starvation takes 40 to 60 days.
Yeah. And I think another thing I'm learning, we're really fortunate to have humanitarians on our team, and a growing number of, because they have expertise in things that I don't even know exist. And so I find myself continually asking them questions and saying, look, man, I am not challenging you on the correctness of what you're saying. I'm acknowledging my idiocy and trying to understand, where do I need to be to get up with you? There are tests to determine whether a child is starving, or truly starving, or just really skinny. I look at it as just a regular guy with no training in these things, and I go, I can see that kid's rib bones. That tears my heart in half. I apply that vision to my child and think, we got to do something. Humanitarians, who we think of perhaps are not as pragmatic or as driven by, specific, disciplined, whatever, planning action as a military person, go, no, we need to go through these steps, and we will clarify who is starving versus who's in critical wasting versus who is in whatever else category, because that helps us titrate how we apply the food aid that we have.
If I could add to, because it's important, we focused on, the military part of our team because it's, I guess, unusual in the humanitarian. But we do have former UN, former World Food Program, former World Central Kitchen, which is an NGO. We have several and so forth. So it's the combination, I think, of the two that make us effective. It's not just, military guys with our planning skills. It's both, because we've, we have run into some issues when who we're talking to, when some people have issues with the U.S. military. We were kind of surprised at the level and the upfront with it. But anyway, so we've learned a lot from our humanitarians on our team, which are equally as important as us, but it's important to make sure that comes across.
And getting to like the, I guess, philosophy that underpins your set, and I mean, God, what you're saying about just that visceral reaction of like, what if this was my child? It seems like your guys' specialty is taking on problems that sort of seem impossible or like staggeringly upsetting, and like in the case of child soldiers. And I'm wondering, like, how do you, I'm always fascinated by that, whether it's in endurance sports or humanitarianism, or like deciding to take action on a problem that seems impossible. How do you do that? And kind of to that point about stubbornness, how do you know you're on the right side of courageousness versus hard-headedness?
I mean, I could start. We think our skill is that's what we're familiar with. We spent 20 years in conflict zones. We've seen the worst of the worst and the worst of humanity, and you could get pretty jaded, quite frankly, about humanity, period. Which is why so many vets end up moving to isolated places and hanging out with their dog, right? And to be frank, I live in Montana and I love hanging out with my dog, so I might fit that bill exactly. But the easy stuff, they don't probably need us. There's plenty of people that want to do that, and I just don't think we're just not as well needed. We want to take on the hard cases, and we want to basically, what FOGBA does is enable humanitarian groups, right? We're not trying to replace anybody. Like, these people have been doing this for decades and decades, and they don't necessarily need us coming in like we're all of a sudden, God's gift to humanitarian work. We're there to facilitate and enable what they're already doing. That's our mission. If we can add to what's going on, then we want to be there. If we can't, then we'll go. There's no like over too many people are not volunteering to serve in terrible places, right? They're not at a surplus yet. Until they're at a surplus, then we think we can find that spot. And yeah, is it a challenge? Does stubbornness help? Yes, it does. Because I don't know how many times when we first came with the concept, they said it would never work. When we were talking to governments, they just flat out said it'll never work. We've already looked at it. We had our Navy look at it. This beach thing you're talking about, it won't work. And then we just keep telling them, like, look, wait a minute. We'll go over every specification of how we would build this temporary port facility, for example, until the point where they finally said, oh, hell, that'll work. Right. So, I mean, that's the persistence. We could have just presented it the first time we presented it, been told we were, that everybody's already looked at this and won't work, until the point where we got people buying into it, right? But it did run up against the political issues, particularly in Gaza, and we're expanding. So we're not going to just be in Gaza. We're looking at, doing things in Sudan and potentially Haiti and other things around the world. So we don't want to just be in the most politically, tense humanitarian, but we're also not giving up there. We are still looking to adjust the maritime corridor to be able to bring aid in there. It's up to somebody else to approve it and to get behind it, but we still have a plan to do that, and we're expanding. So, the stubbornness is important, but it's also important to really look for areas of the world where we can have an impact and not just be, superfluous. It's a bad way to put it, but we need to have a place that we can make a difference, and we're there to enable humanitarian groups. But Sudan, for example, is catastrophic. It actually is so much more intense than Gaza. It gets very little international attention, but there's 25 million people there that are, very close to starvation, and there's almost no the requirements to take care of them is overwhelming, and it's very sparsely funded.
There was the Economist had a thing about it. I think it was last week or the week before, and the numbers they were throwing around were absolutely staggering. I mean,
well, I think that's what's I'm not going to get into what and why I think that is, because it goes to the answering your question, which is that the what and the why when you're trying to solve the problem is in some ways irrelevant, absent actual material fact and actual physical restrictions. You asked about endurance, you asked about persistence and stubbornness. I would say, Mick and I spent between us, roughly 5 decades in trying to solve complex, wicked, almost unsolvable problems. Looking back at it in the history of it, I recognize plenty of flaws and mistakes. I recognize plenty of errors of judgment, planning, just incorrect conclusions, what have you. But what I will never really give up on, because it has become a part of me through those collective 5 decades and my 2.5, is like, I don't spend much time looking at a problem and saying that can't be done. I mean, absent something that is just, like I can't grow a third arm. That's not going to happen. But as I was in New York this week with Mick and a couple other people, and I was looking out over New York and said, the difference in this group that I'm currently working with and maybe somebody else is, I'm looking at that skyscraper over there. And if somebody said to me, hey, that needs to get moved 30 feet to the right, I would start analyzing the how of that, not coming up with reasons it can't be done. Now, I may be proven wrong in my how, but I'm personally interested in the execution of challenging things. I mean, I say all the time, I'm 5'7", 215-pound guy who danced around the Marine Corps weight standards for 1 million years, who became a commando who runs 100-mile races. And John Dailey, who you had on recently, is the same thing. He had the same career I had, although he was an enlisted operator, so he actually did a lot more He-Man stuff than I did. And is one of my fellow riding buddies and is one of my fellow ultramarathon buddies, because we just decide, yeah, that's what we're going to do. And I'm slow at it. And there's been times I've run across a finish line as they were taking it down, at 33 hours into a run. But I learned a lot of lessons along the way about just putting your head down and grinding. And that's, I think, my personal effort or my personal gift is the ability to just put my head down and grind, because it's definitely not innate talent or native intellect or any, magical capability. I am not a guy who has ever gotten by on he's just good. And I think some people who are in the exact same category as I, with all the same gifts and detriments, decide to let the detriments hold them back.
And maybe it's not a coincidence. We have a lot of endurance athletes, at least in endurance sports on our team, right? Maybe that's part of the mentality.
Yeah, the pain cave, right?
Right.
Yeah, and I mean, and
the ability to endure the pain cave.
I think about one particular race I ran in Alabama. It was a 100-mile race, and I quit at mile 87. I was just done. I was like, there's no way. I can't meet the timeline. I'm just done here. And the volunteers at mile 87 said, hey, man, drink a beer, which I don't drink, but okay, sure. I drank a Bud Long Neck at mile 87 of that race and decided, yes, I could indeed complete a half marathon and finish the race. And it took a team, and it took some people to convince me that it was better for me to finish the 13 miles, no matter how long it took and how painful it was, than it was to have quit at 87. And I, in that race, I had become comfortable with the idea of quitting. I'd already come up with my excuse matrix, and how I was going to explain this to all my friends. And yet some people, kind of dusted me off, patted me on the butt, and sent me on my way. And I think you can apply that mentality. I don't mean to be blithe here, but you can apply that mentality to vast humanitarian problems. If somebody's just willing to provide the beer and lift somebody up off the ground and pat them on the butt and send them in the right direction. And I think that's a skill and a magic that Fogboat brings to these situations. Because to echo Mick, I learn every day how much I don't know about humanitarian work. And it is vast, and we are blessed to have the humanitarians we have to fill the gaps that I have. But I am willing to just keep grinding at this, because what's the alternative? Mick just said there's 25 million people starving. There's 1.7 million internally displaced people in Gaza. That number is magnified by tens in Sudan. Both of those situations are obviously exacerbated by a hot war going on in either one. I could just choose to stay home. And actually I do. I do all my work out of this room, which is another point to be made, which is somebody has to go forward and execute, which Mick is on the road nonstop. But there are huge amounts of things that can be done by people who care from wherever they are. A little bit of action combined with a little bit of action time and time again can become a big action.
And that's a perfect point I'd like to just highlight, because this is one of the reasons why Worth and I have been doing podcasts on this topic. Is there is a place for veterans who have retired and are looking for, something to do, something good to do in this space. And so we'd like to highlight that, because there are skills that they have. And there's nothing wrong with like going into security stuff, but if they're looking to not do that, not carry the black rifle and wear the Oakleys, I guess you can still wear the Oakleys, but you can do this. There's plenty of space for you to do this, and your skills are important. And yeah, might be some resistance by humanitarians, but you know what? Too bad. We could use more folks, and I can tell you right now, Roger, who's our chief logistics officer, is the MVP of our team. Right? He might have been in support in the past with all the commandos leading the charge, but like if you were anything, you could be valuable. Any kind of MOS, you could be valuable in this, but especially like the support. The guys that did the support, the logistics, those kind of things are super helpful. And we've had humanitarians just flat out tell us on our team, like, I would have been logistics leads in humanitarian operations. I have never been trained in logistics. Like they will admit that the skills that come out of the U.S. military on that front are unparalleled. And so it's a pitch for those veterans who, like Worth saying, you retired to the mountains in North Carolina or Montana or what have you. You could still be actively involved and do a lot of good. And if you're interested, reach out to us. We can certainly, it might not be us, but there's groups all over the place. A lot of them were founded, with the fall of Kabul, and they're still in existence. They're doing good stuff.
You took the words. That was my next question, was about the role of this kind of work in someone's transition or coming home. And it seems to me that almost like moral purpose can be the salve for a moral wound. I think about my dad. He had and now he's finally at 97, slowing down a little bit, but he had this lifelong restlessness, and that is kind of your textbook undiagnosed PTSD. Probably a lot of that. It not necessarily pathological, but just the loneliness of coming home and leaving military. But he found himself, he worked in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. He was in South Africa during the AIDS epidemic when he should have been fully retired, doing like field work. But he just found himself in that work and got to, that's what brought him home, not being thanked profusely for his service, or raising a family, or even being successful in business. there was that, it was still in him to be in situations that called for those skills.
Yeah.
I mean, that's need. You nailed it, right? A moral sap can be I don't know exactly what you said, but moral goodness.
It sounded really good, Charlie. You should coin that. It was, it wasn't good, but it was good. It was good. We should read
as a fellow writer, write that down in your notebook, stuff to write later.
Write it down.
But you're right. I mean, and it is something of a need, right? So a lot of this was born, Lobo was born out of Mick and Eric's need to address a critical issue that they see in the world and saw very close and personally in the world. The Kabul evacuation issue was, I have to do something. Now, the thing about having to do something, and I've been the guy at times who needed to do something, and so I struck out in 97 different directions ineffectively. And what I would say is, that's ultimately nothing more than panic, right? That's a panic response. I think back to the time that I drove my uncle's truck into a pond when I was 15 years old, and I won't go into the how of all that, but I then tried 15 different ways to get the truck out of the pond before acknowledging to anyone else that the truck was in the pond. What it took was a wrecker to come pull the thing out. And now with Fogbo and these kind of efforts, you've got a cadre of people who have spent decades taking a deep breath before addressing a problem. I say to young Marine officers all the time, the first time you get shot at, before you get on the radio to start telling your Marines what to do, take a deep breath before you click the handset, because they desperately need to hear you not freaking out. And I think back to the very first time I was ever in a firefight, and I wasn't freaking out, but I was a bit excited. And I got on a satellite phone because I couldn't talk via the normal radio methods that we had. You have primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency communication plans. I called a very experienced master gunnery sergeant, now retired, good friend of mine, and I was a bit out of breath and a bit excited, and I was telling him all the things that happened and various editorial comments I had. And then he goes, okay, all that's good, but are you going to go execute the raid or not? And I was a bit taken aback, like he was not being properly emotionally supportive for me in my time of excitement. And then I went, yeah, man. I was real mad at him. I was like, yeah, we're going to do that. And I realized the challenge he gave me was the challenge I needed, right? And it snapped me back into calm and allowed me to move forward and execute the tasks that we had come there to do in the first place, which was go try and roll up some bad guy. And now Fogbo is kind of trying to be the deep breath and the application of oil on the waters to say, here's a systematic way to attack a very challenging problem. And we have a lot of different players who speak a lot of different languages, but if we just build all this into one network, it's amazing what we can accomplish. And the other beauty there is I'm happy to step back. I don't need the credit. I don't need notoriety. I don't need photography. That can all be the people who have been in this space for years and years and years, and this is their mission, to be on the ground feeding babies. My mission is to support.
And if I could add to the idea of, like you're talking about your father, which I think is very consistent with a lot of veterans, I think there's multi dimensions to that. So you think about, from the U.S. perspective, a young middle-class American, although we might think when we're there that they have a hard life, they really don't, right? Compared to other people around the world. And they sign up for the right reasons and go, especially during our era, fight the nation's wars. And although, they're fully capable, they're fully, super smart, they're super physically fit, it's just a shock to see what conflict is around the world. It's not something that you can ever learn by playing Call of Duty, right? So, and they're required to do some pretty rough stuff. Whereas even if you're completely consistent with the law of armed conflict, it's pretty rough. So they see that stuff, and then a lot of them spend the rest of their life, wanting to make up for something. To be frank, even if they did nothing wrong. and people can tell them they did nothing wrong. So that's a part of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why vets do not only gravitate to this humanitarian sphere, but are comforted by it. And the other part is the mission, right? There's very few missions out there from the mentality of a military type person or a military person that really match it. It is complete devotion to something that's larger than yourself. It's not selling widgets. It's not selling stocks. It's not selling whatever you're selling, insurance. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, but it's just never going to reach the level of a mission of a Marine or a Ranger or a SEAL or, keep going. This does have that sense of mission, right? It really does. And so when you get there and you go, holy mackerel, like we're feeding babies that are starving. Like, is there any other mission that a human should treasure more than that? I can't think of it. So I do think there's a lot of things that are natural for vets when it comes to this area. And I know we're pushing that because that's one of our, things we want to do, but it really does. I think they find a lot of peace. I know I did in doing this that you can't really find anywhere else. And sometimes the vets look for peace in things that aren't helpful, like at the bottom of the bottle or something. So this is different. This is a different way to look at things. And hopefully the ones that do will find that.
Now, obviously, you guys have devoted a big portion of your lives to military service, and you've talked about how that has influenced the work you're doing now. But you're also lifelong readers. And I know we're short on time, and the last time Worth and I started talking about books and writing, it turned into a very long conversation. But yeah, tell me a little bit about that, and I guess also, like, how did being a reader, a student of history, a student of stoicism shape your not just the work you're doing now, but your military career, your mission in the broadest sense of the word?
I mean, I'll talk to reading. I'm going to leave any discussions of stoicism to Mick, because the depth of my understanding is reading Meditations in the morning. But it's a good start. But with that said, I to quote Mick's old boss, Secretary and General Mattis, kind of famously said, I've never encountered a situation that was new to me, because I've read and read and read. I find that, the most direct applicability of that was I had read every book you could read about being a recon guy or a Army long-range recon guy. So by the time I got there, I had been reading how-tos about how to pack your rucksack, how to walk a patrol, don't cross the trail this way, do cross the trail that way. I was really fascinated by first-person historical accounts. And I still go back to those things because they're really important to me. I just read a great book about Chosin Reservoir. But I think those are very instructive. The other thing that's important that reading does for me in this work is reminds me that A, this is not the first time this has happened. B, you're not the only person who's ever dealt with this. C, there's this entire human network. Now, that doesn't mean that at times I haven't still felt isolated, but at least I could look and go, all right, somebody else dealt with this. How did they deal with it? Did it work? Did it not work? What were their thoughts? As far as reading, and really for me now writing, a lot of that is processing. I lead 2 different veterans writing therapy groups. One I do 6 times a year at the Traumatic Brain Injury Clinic at Camp Lejeune, the Intrepid Spirit Clinic. And that's almost all active duty Marines and sailors and the occasional soldier. And then I lead 2 8-week courses annually for the North Carolina Veterans Writing Alliance for vets. All of those are free to all of the participants. And they're not about turning vets into writers. They're about turning vets into people who write to get things out and apply that moral salve. But I think reading is tremendously instructive. I don't have much use, honestly, for people who operate in these human spheres, be they combat, humanitarian work, whatever, who haven't invested time in trying to understand the fullness of the history of what they've done, the future of where it's going, what do the leading thinkers think, et cetera. Because it doesn't demonstrate the kind of intellectual curiosity that indicates you're somebody that's going to be an asset in the actual execution of the work.
Yeah, and I'd say, as they say, you never learn anything when you're talking, right? You only learn when you're listening. And I kind of feel that reading is just that. It's listening, right? You have this, it is a way to listen to people who have come before you, who have tried things that either did work or didn't work. It is everything that work just laid out there. So if you're not reading, then you're not learning a whole lot, quite frankly. So I would start with that. I know people have gotten away from it, technology and all that, but to the extent that you can, you should really, maybe I'm just geared this way, just set a goal to read a certain amount and do it, right? And if that's what works for you, it works for me. I try to read a book a week. Not always easy, on the road all the time. But if it's, I'm going to set aside an hour before I go to sleep to read, do it. You will be a better person for it. On the Stoicism, and I can totally geek out. I've been a Stoic. My dad used it to teach ethics. So I was a Stoic when it wasn't cool. Not that it wasn't uncool, but nobody knew it. I grew up, all over the place, but mostly in the deep South where, everybody was a Southern Baptist, a Presbyterian, a Methodist, and they'd ask me and I'd be like, I'm a Stoic. And they just look at me cross-eyed and stuff. But now it's had a resurgence, right? So, I'm in this sphere. I talk a lot about it. I write a lot about it. So when I meet people, it's interesting how some people don't care about the national security stuff I do or ABC. It's just, they go straight to the Stoicism. And a lot of young people, which is great. I hope that it stays as popular because ultimately, just like reading, in my experience, you will be better off if you not to have to be Stoicism, but you follow something that's based on virtue ethics. And just to make it short, I obviously like good people. I really don't like bad people, but I really, really don't like hypocrites. Somebody who pretends to be good, but is bad. I'd rather you just tell me you're a bad person, to be honest. And Stoicism are trying to follow that philosophy. If you're going to talk about it and you don't do it, then you're the worst of the categories, right? So when I get on a Stoicism podcast and talk about, courage and justice and wisdom and self-discipline and how eudaimonia is a term they use for living the good life, isn't about the car you drive or the house you own or any of that crap. It's all about whether you are a good person and whether you do good in the world. Two different things. Then it's hard to go out and not do any of those things, or you're just full of shit. So that's, to me, why that philosophy has always been with me, and it has a long history in Western civilization and the military, quite frankly. Not that it is at all exclusive to it, but that's why it keeps me honest, put it that way. And you could do that with religion too, whichever religion you are, but that really resonates with me. And I think when I talk to young people, particularly that are getting into this, is the positive aspect of it. And so for me, that's what I do, but there's plenty of ways to get to that.
And I remember being introduced to the idea of, then it wasn't until I read Ryan Holiday that I learned, because I knew about Epictetus and Seneca and the classic Stoics. I didn't realize there's this vibrant tradition of modern Stoics, whether you're talking about Viktor Frankl, Stockdale, and then, in the South.
Mandela.
Yep, and big time. Yeah. And then I think, given the history in the American South, there was a culture of, probably like Harper Lee maybe fictionalized it perfectly.
I like that.
But it's interesting, especially at a time when because I think too, there's hypocrisy, but also like cynicism, and like whataboutism as kind of a rhetorical tactic seems to be having a moment right now.
Yeah,
and it seems like a very strong counterpoint to that.
Yeah, and I know Ryan, great dude, and I think he's doing a lot to really reach out to the young folks. In fact, me and Eric Ulrich, or the SEAL that we referenced, that's our chief op, we were just visiting a friend of his who's the first SEAL commandant of the midshipmen at the Naval Academy. And oddly enough, when we talked to him, he's like, "Hey, you're Stoic. You might know the guy that just spoke last night, who's Ryan Holiday." So he came to talk to and it, to give Ryan a plug, and he didn't ask me to do this. It's almost like he has this bookstore that's called Painted Porch, of course, because that's the reference to the Stoa, which is where they get the term, the porch, in this little town in Texas. So it's almost like a pilgrimage you go to. And I went down there to do the podcast, but he is one of I think, the real driving forces for this resurgence among young people. And right now it is mostly young men. It does attract men. Like I said, it really plays it, but it needs to expand and attract more ladies, because there are Stoic ladies in the past. Nancy Sherman, a friend of mine, another modern Stoic that's really bringing a lot of people into the fold. But yeah, glad you mentioned Ryan.
And
great work.
For anyone looking for, and she's out in podcast world, an interesting like young woman Stoic. There's a wealth climber named Hazel Findlay, and she is kind of just an avid reader of philosophy, and she's mentions these things, but she puts a huge emphasis on mindset. And Worth, very similar to what you were saying, is incorporating an understanding of philosophy and psychology into a extreme sport.
Your name is Finley? I got to write this down.
I think it's Findley.
Ley?
Yeah.
So that's Irish for courageous one, by the way. So it's kind of makes sense.
Oh, I didn't realize. Amazing. Yep. I'm pretty sure I'm almost certain she's Welsh. But she's from Britain anyway. What are you guys reading now?
Mick? Oh, I have the book right here. And no, I'm not. It's one. Of course, I'm on the road all the time. I'm reading this. It's Autocracy Incorporated by Anne Applebaum, about to start our conversation. We're talking about this, right? It's about this. He's very good, and it's a very. Hopefully, I'll get it done this weekend. But it's a very good read about the current resurgence of autocracies, and I highly recommend it. I do, unfortunately, have to jump on a call that just started on Sudan and getting food to starving folks. So I'm going to have to cut out, because I'm kind of leading this discussion.
Mick, that is eminently more important than a podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of the week.
All right, Mick, see you later.
Bye, brother.
And Worth, what are you reading?
So let's see. Last night I finished a detective novel, because I try to read about 3 serious books and then just take a mental cleanser. So I read a book called The Off Islanders by, I think it's Peter Colt. I can't remember. He's a cop up in New England and in his writer life, and an Army reservist. So that was an interesting little detective novel set in the 80s. And the protagonist is a Vietnam vet. And I grew up reading every book I could on Vietnam. I was borderline obsessed with Vietnam, probably through the first 20, until I was 25 or 26. And a lot of that, really what I was interested in the battle, et cetera, and the strategy and all that. But I was really interested in the veteran experience post-Vietnam. And so that book was interesting. It's set in 82 or 83. Immediately before that, I had read Coral Comes High by George P. Hunt, which is a book that a Marine buddy recommended. I had never heard of it. George P. Hunt was a company commander at Peleliu, who spent the rest of his life as a writer, primarily at Fortune magazine. But he received the Navy Cross and the Silver Star during World War II, and wrote Coral Comes High in 1945-46. It was very fresh in his mind. The Navy Cross came from his time commanding the company at Peleliu. So that is 147 pages. You can pick up a reprint for $8 or $9 on Amazon. I was so into it that I went out and found a signed first edition, and bought that just to have it. So I really am pushing that book hard right now. It's not that it's such a beautiful piece of writing or that you learn something so much about Pele. It's honestly about how he almost is at a remove from his own experience as he's writing the book. And so he's describing what the Marines did around him, but it's written by a real live, credible writer. But I'm just amazed and intrigued by how disconnected he was from his own experience. And I think that's normal and natural and healthy, but it's not at all polemic. It's not at all overwrought. So anyway, I'm pushing that pretty hard. I started Dennis Johnson's Tree of Smoke last night.
Oh, it's a weird one.
Yeah, I frankly, I don't know anything about it. I know I'm supposed to read it. I know it's a book on everybody's list, and it's a Vietnam book, so I've had it in the stack to the right of my desk for about 4 years now. And then I just picked up The Tyranny of the Minority.
I've heard good things.
I have not cracked it, so I can't speak to it other than to say I am reading it. It seems to have applicability in this day and age. So those are the things I got going on right at the minute.
Brilliant. I'm after writing those down, and Dennis Johnson. I remember in college reading Jesus' Son like 10 times. The one I'll share what I'm reading only because I think you would, if you haven't already encountered this book, you definitely find it interesting. It might have been helpful in your last career, but The Essentials of Sea Survival, and by Frank Golden, MD, and Michael Tipton, one of whom I think he's like on retainer with the RNLI in the UK, the Royal National Lifeboat Institute. And it was something that was recommended to me on an incident management course for sea kayaking. And it's, unfortunately it's out of print. And I think its last printing was like 2006 or something. So some of the studies in it are a little dated, and some of them are anyway originated right after World War II. But it's basically, it started with the scientific question of how come so many men who ended up in lifeboats and life rafts in World War II died later. And it's like, spoiler alert, hypothermia. And basically, unless you're in the tropics, you die of hypothermia and something else. Or this guy was the person who pioneered the understanding of cold water shock, that a lot of people, when they fall into cold, they don't even live long enough to get to hypothermia. They drown due to like muscle failure or inhaling water. Anyway, it's basically just dozens of ways to die at sea, and an explanation scientifically of what's going on with your body's metabolism and respiration and thermoregulation.
Well, actually, I'm going to say probably. I'm going to qualify my answer. I will probably seek that out. And the reason I say probably is my favorite uncle disappeared at sea. 28.
When?
And,
sorry?
When he was 28, it was 1983. No, not 1983, 1981. I wrote an essay about it for a magazine that I write pretty regularly. It's one of the things that I was like, if I'm ever a real writer, I'm going to write this up to get it out.
Wow.
And it is amazing the impacts on a family that losing somebody in that way has. And I think when I was in high school, I was kind of obsessed with the POW MIA issue from Vietnam, and I think that was not a small part of it. But anyway, I wrote that down, and
yeah, there is something very insidious and cruel about being lost at sea. Yeah. Probably not unlike MIA, where it's like there's always that question mark hanging over.
Right. I mean, and there's just the mystery of, where is this person? You never get to fill that gap in a way that, hey, we had a funeral, we put the body in the ground or in the cremation or whatever. There's absolutely that. He disappeared off the coast of Southeast Georgia along with two other guys. And about 2 years ago in the same region, there was another case of 3 guys who disappeared. And it was all fishing. My uncle was in a fishing tournament. They got canceled, but that was before somebody could call you on your cell phone and say, hey man, head back in, the fishing thing's canceled. And likewise, these young men were out fishing and just never came home. And I don't know their families at all, but I feel a tremendous kinship to them because I feel like I know some of what they've gone through.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, the kind of familial bonds of the sea and the way it can transcend all sorts of things of whether it's national boundaries or what. I mean, you look at in warfare, you know, they were rescuing crews of the ship they had just sunk on the other side because the law of the sea commands it, you know.
Yeah, I just read Professor Payson Phillips O'Brien's book, The Strategist. He's an American strategy professor in Scotland. And it talks extensively about U-boat warfare. And the book tracks Hitler, Mussolini, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill through their wars and then into the war they administered.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it explores them personally and their experiences personally and ties how those personal experiences characterize how they fought World War II or directed World War II. And there's a fair bit about, you know, U-boat warfare and the massive sea convoys in the North Atlantic between the States and the UK. And I thought a lot about all that. And I've also been doing a fair bit of reading lately about the Pacific. And you think about, you know, how a combatant becomes a non-combatant when they're floating in the water, and then what are your obligations?
Yeah, I know. Well, and I mean the kind of founding father of your community and special operations in the U.S. generally, and JFK was a PT boat captain who was shipwrecked.
Yeah, and he was a friend of my grandfather.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, my great uncle was a senator for 39 years, and his nephew, my grandfather, was a judge and was active in politics when he came home from World War II. He fought at Okinawa as a machine gunner, and then came home and finished law school and etc. But so I've kind of grown up reading a lot about JFK and having relatives who had very personal connections with both JFK and then Johnson. So yeah, big fan of reading about that and thinking about how their experiences colored their behavior later, which is why I enjoyed O'Brien's book so much. And I also hard at, you know, our current state. And I'm the last person who believes that's not true. I am increasingly actually a person who believes in national service. And for years I was very libertarian and argued pretty extensively in favor of selfishness. And now I feel like 2 years in the service of the nation is not a bad idea. When I look at how the greatest generation came home and dealt with issues that frankly to me are much more substantial than a lot that we're dealing with now, and yet somehow perhaps making more destructive to our national fiber. I think there's a value in some common experience in understanding one another and in communicating.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. My wife is Swiss, and so her dad and her brother both had to do the national specifically they had to be in the army, and it's really interesting some of the stories they tell, and the subtext being that, and you know, of course, this is Switzerland, this country that is not deploying. It's a purely defensive military, but it's kind of not the point at the same time. You know, you like her brother told me a story that, you know, there were recruits in his barracks who didn't know there were Black people in Switzerland because they came from like a farm somewhere where they hadn't really seen very much of their own country and they hadn't met a lot of the people who lived in it. And like, I'm sure that was a wake-up call in both directions. And
well, that goes back to you opened asking me about the dichotomy of the barracks. Dichotomy of the barracks comes from that exposure and that experience, and the idea that you can end up very good friends or even best friends with somebody whose background is not remotely yours, I tell you, I lead this veterans class, and we were talking about that the other night. And a guy in my group who I know outside of the group, and was talking about how his best friend in the Army was a guy who's a 6'2", 112-pound skinny white rapper.
Love
you know, that's a culture unto itself. And then this guy is a hardcore musician who was just covered in tats from head to toe, but also an evangelical Christian. And so he's like, our backgrounds couldn't have been any more different. Our belief systems couldn't have been any more different. And he's like, and the guy's one of the greatest human beings I've ever known, best man at my wedding, his wedding. So there's this thing that service brings together. There's this thing that service under dangerous conditions brings together. I was up in New York last week at a fogbow thing. I was in New York the week before because one of the guys from my platoon in Iraq lost his mom. And I was like, okay, let me shift everything I'm supposed to do this week for a trip to New York to this funeral. And I do that because we're, very, very close friends, but we're very, very close friends because we met under very adverse conditions and shared commonality.
Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me today, and, for all the things that you are doing with what, what you learned from those experiences. It's
Thanks for letting me. I'm still consistently amazed that anybody's interested in sitting down and talking to me for an hour. And I'm even more amazed that anybody else, spend some time to listen to it. But to all who do, thank you.
Well, thanks again. If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at daileypros.com or on LinkedIn. My links, Worth's, and Mick's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.